There is a tendency among Western anime fans when talking about the films of Studio Ghibli, and in particular, the works of Hayao Miyazaki, to preface whatever insightful analysis or commentary they're about to provide by stating how unlike Disney the work is. Every single time. Given the hegemonic nature of Disney, and its utter dominance over the mindscape of how Western audiences understand what animation is and, significantly, who it is for. This compulsion of differentiation is, if nothing else, understandable. But there's a problem. In their desire to cast off the shackles of the Disneyfication of animation, commentators are, ironically, forging an entirely new set of ideological fetters, blinding them to what is, figuratively, right in front of them. At a structural level, Princess Mononoke is the tale of a virtuous prince rescuing a princess who has been placed under an enchantment. The entire narrative of the film hangs on this singular, fundamental element, and by examining what others have had to say about Princess Mononoke, why this perspective has been ignored will become apparent. Feminist readings of Princess Mononoke are, in 2021, exceedingly common. This has as much to do with the film itself as it does with the vaunted status of Miyazaki in contemporary pop feminist discourse, Ghibli as a progressive panacea to Disney. These readings go back to at least 2000, and with good cause. The film is a panoply of strong female characters. The unanimity of a feminist reading of the film becomes very apparent with even a cursory glance at the scholarly discourse which has developed around it, and I don't think it would be unreasonable to state that this has become the dominant interpretation of the film in the West among academics, if not anime fans in general. This is encapsulated quite deftly in Felicity M's 2019 video, How Princess Mononoke is a Feminist Film. What's interesting about this video is how it inverts the established reading to instead use the film as a lens through which to discuss feminism itself.
Although the main character is a young man, the supporting female characters San and Iboshi drive the story. The plot revolves around these two women and their conflict, which is that of the protection and destruction of the forest. But through a feminist lens, San and Iboshi aren't fighting over a forest, they're fighting over feminism.
Feminism, despite conservative, reactionary, and liberal pretenses, is not a singular trans-historical ideology, but a complex and historically contingent assortment of varying perspectives about the function of gender and its relationship to existing power structures, typified as the patriarchy. As such, holding that there is some singular feminism, let alone a singular feminist reading of a film like Princess Mononoke, can be fraught. In a media environment which is understood to be bereft of female characters who are treated as subjects and not objects, hyperfixating on subversive representations when they do happen is perfectly understandable. Much is made, for example, of the rivalry between Iboshi and San. Their duel is one of the most memorable action set pieces of the film after all, and when examined intratextually, both characters stand out among their peers for their dimensionality and depth of character. However, within the world of the film itself, participation in combat is the norm, not the exception. Indeed, as Susan Napier notes, the cast is comprised almost entirely of those typically found outside the traditional social order of Japan during the Muromachi period. As a result, fixation on the way that San or Iboshi define the expected gender norms of the Western audience can also belie the ways in which their characterization also incorporates aspects which are typically coded as feminine. While being able to seamlessly move from behaviors traditionally associated with femininity to those typified as masculine subverts any easy notions of gender essentialist readings, this tendency to overcorrect by focusing on the typically masculine has produced unintended analytic consequences. This can be observed in the broader discourse surrounding the film, where ascribing intentionality to Miyazaki telling a feminist story subsumes other readings of the text. It is not enough that a film embodies feminist representations of gender and fully realized female characters. It must also have been Miyazaki's goal to produce a feminist film. However, because of the influence of feminist readings of his entire body of work among Western audiences, a process which largely began with Princess Mononoke, this presumed intentionality is more reflective of a projection of expectations from that audience than a matter of the production itself. Nevertheless, this presumed intentionality on Miyazaki's part continues to dominate the discourse, reinforced as it is by the substantial weight given to feminist readings of his work, and can obscure structural elements which may be seen as not aligning with his assumed progressive tendencies, if observed at all, will then be analyzed not in terms of their function within the film, but rather as the outcome of the so-called Disneyfication of Mononoke Hime. The images you are currently viewing are the Japanese and American posters of Princess Mononoke respectively. There are obvious differences between the two, and this is not gone unremarked by scholars when discussing the marketing of Mononoke Hime in the US as Princess Mononoke. As Laz Carter notes, Ashitaka becomes the aggressive warrior in the center of the poster, with the sentence, "The fate of the world rests on the courage of one warrior," newly added, which immediately foreshadows the warrior's valor. By performing this paratextual replacement, even the selection of a protagonist becomes subject to Disneyfication. The remarketing process has removed the complexity of strong female characterization. On the face of it, this makes sense, especially given the state of the film industry in the US in 2000. Doubly so when you consider who the film was ultimately marketed toward. The problem, however, is that during the development of Mononoke Hime, Miyazaki had intended for the film to be called Ashitaka no Seki, the Tale of Ashitaka, and only went with Mononoke Hime because producer Toshio Suzuki had already issued a preemptive press release with that title. Given the narrative of the film, this isn't remotely surprising, but it cuts to the heart of how fears about Disneyfication can establish ideological constraints which obscure what is otherwise evidently apparent.
So Ashitaka shows up and talks to Princess Mononoke, or at least that's what the chapter on the Blu-ray says, because she's neither a princess nor named Mononoke, as that's just a translation of Mononoke Hime, or loosely translated as Spirit Princess, which makes the princess title more of an ironic prefix and a nickname more than anything else, as the forest spirits merely adopted her as their own. But Disney gotta eat, so now she's Princess Mononoke standing alongside the other Disney. Oh, for f***'s sake, I'm gonna be sick.
Now this seems like just a one-off joke, but the marginalization of San's status as a princess and ignoring Ashitaka's status as a prince causes an ideological block to manifest. The justification for refusing to engage with this aspect of their characters falls back on treating their inclusion as mere marketing, at the behest of Disney no less. This significantly affects Mikey's reading of the film and the conclusions he makes about the characters, their motivations, and ultimately what the film is about. As has been shown, there was already a deliberate intentionality behind the choice of Princess Mononoke, but for often as it is mentioned, the fact that Ashitaka is a prince was also very important. According to Steve Alpert, during the first script reading, a member of the Miramax staff asked why Ashitaka was called a prince. Neil Gaiman, the scriptwriter, replied, "Because he is a prince." There was some back and forth until finally Gaiman stated, "Look, his being a prince is important to the story. It's part of his character. I believe it's what Mr. Miyazaki decided. We're supposed to be adapting this for an American audience, not changing it." Given this, it becomes obvious that the difficulty with interpreting the title of Princess as a result of Disneyfication is that it dehistoricizes the localization of the film, as it was not directly distributed by Disney, but rather its Miramax subsidiary, as noted by Emma Pett. Disney's decision to release Princess Mononoke on the Miramax label therefore suggests that there was an awareness that the film might be more readily received as an art house product than as family fare. Fundamentally, Princess Mononoke was not aimed at the presumed target audience of traditional Disney animated films, so the utility of emphasizing the word princess to maximize marketability doesn't make sense. Further, this attitude engenders these ideological fetters, because Movies with Mikey doesn't feel the need to look any deeper into what the term Mononoke encompasses either, while also missing why San being couched as a princess is structurally significant. San is, after all, the adopted daughter of the wolf god Moro. Her name means three, or third, as in third child, and the title of princess serves a dual structural purpose. On the one hand, as noted by Jennifer Nicholson, San is the respected daughter of the wolf god and soon to be inheritor of her domain. But the name has significance to the human side of the conflict as well. From the perspective of the inhabitants of Irontown, San represents a young girl who has been possessed by the nature spirits and turned against her own kind. Eboshi couches her conflict with San in terms of a civilizing mission, and this will be important later, but what if San isn't possessed by nature spirits at all, but by something else entirely? Ashitaka, on the other hand, is the last prince of the Amishi, traditionally understood to be a rival ethnic group who were pushed to the fringes as the Yamato polity expanded during the 8th century, though the historic reality is a bit more complex. Ashitaka does, however, embody the very essence of what is popularly required to be considered a prince. He is kind, he is heroic, and literally self-sacrificing. Far from being some meaningless title, Ashitaka's function as the moral compass of the film is integral to the narrative. Ironically, in the broader historical context of the Muromachi era, despite their deserved royal appellations, San and Ashitaka remain outsiders from the perspective of the imperial court, Ashikaga shogunate, or even Irontown. These distinctions offer no socio-political status or privileges, yet a conscious decision was made on part of Ghibli, and it needs to be remarked, Disney as well, to establish their noble status. Why? I've discussed how the emphasis on the subversion of gendered expectations and pretenses to Disneyfication have marginalized the structural elements of the narrative, but what does this mean? Between 1932 and 1936, anthropologist Stith Thompson created the Motif Index of Folk Literature, with a revised and expanded edition being composed between 1955 and 1958. This text, along with the Arne Thompson Tale Type Index, were extremely influential in the development of the academic study of folklore, though, like any text, they are not without their criticisms and detractors. The index divides folklore into a number of motifs, which are further subdivided into subtypes, and from this, general observations about commonalities across cultural boundaries can be made, among other functions, of course. It is important to mention that a major criticism of the Motif Index is its apparent Eurocentrism, and so of what value would such an index have when approaching a decidedly Japanese text like Princess Mononoke?
Looking specifically at the body of work of perhaps one of the greatest filmmakers of all time, Hayao Miyazaki, we see that his films are definitely not made specifically for kids. His films are made for everyone, regardless of age. This is because they contain honest and thus universal depictions of human nature. Children and adults alike can identify with Kiki's coming into her own as a young woman, Chihiro's quest to save her parents and grow as a person, and even Jiro's dreams of flight. Miyazaki often throws his wide-eyed young characters into worlds that, while heightened and fantastic, mirror the moral complexity of the world that we all inhabit. This is the journey of Prince Ashitaka.
Dean Hughes outlines very succinctly his perspective on why Miyazaki's films appeal to not only a broad Japanese audience, but to an international audience as well. It is worth considering that a significant swath of commentary on Western audiences' reactions to and appreciation of Princess Mononoke stems from his perception as a uniquely Japanese work, even when filtered through its American localization. However, it is also important to note two interrelated aspects of the world building that went into the film. First, while any commentary and Miyazaki's own notes state that the film was set during the Muromachi period, which traditionally spanned over 230 years, this representation of history is populated with figures and technologies ranging from the Jomon period to the Nanbochuko to the Sengoku Jidai, and even the 20th century. Isao Takahata, the co-founder of Ghibli, even remarked that the film was really a fantasy, and that it was going to give audiences an inaccurate representation of history. And second, it needs to be noted that while Miyazaki indeed took a lot of elements from Japanese folklore and local legends, he also took inspiration from a variety of cultures when crafting the story and the world. For example, when Miyazaki was asked if the film was based on Japanese mythology, he responded that it is influenced by the story of Gilgamesh rather than Japanese mythology. Or when asked about the design of the Kodama, remarked, "I gave them, the Kodama, a certain flavor, but I think there were many creatures like them. People who live in countries covered in forests all believed in those types of creatures, just as they remain for the Celtic people. It must have been the same for the Germanic people as well. As human beings became more powerful and the darkness of the forests began to disappear, those types of creatures came to exist only in fairy tales." All this to say, it is always worth considering how the malleability of history and the transnational flow of cultures permeates any simplistic barriers separating Japanese and non-Japanese elements of storytelling. And so, the folklore motif which I want to focus on, what I have been calling the narrative structure of Princess Mononoke, is an incredibly simple one. Motif D, magic. Subtype D5, enchanted person. See also the entire section on transformation. No real difference seems to exist between transformation and enchantment. A bewitched or enchanted person may, however, retain his original physical form, but may be affected mentally or morally. I said it was incredibly simplistic, but to be as precise as possible, this reading of Princess Mononoke incorporates folklore motif D.791.2.1, disenchantment of girl only by lover. There is a sequence in the film where Eboshi and Ashitaka are walking the battlements of Irontown, and she remarks,
"And Princess Mononoke will become human.
Princess Mononoke?
Princess of the spirits of ghouls, beasts, and ancient gods."
This is the singular time in the entire span of the film that San is ever referred to as Princess Mononoke, and it is at this point that the path to Ashitaka's salvation and the answer to his curse is revealed. Dean Hughes noted that the real villain of the film is the conflict itself, and that this manifests as hatred. Ashitaka's curse manifests physically through the growing malignancy on his arm, yet because of his status as the noble prince, even as his body decays, his spirit remains pure. San, on the other hand, is also forced to live a cursed existence, physically human, but spiritually of the spirits and gods of the forest, morally compromised, her sole purpose to kill Eboshi. The irony here is that San isn't possessed by the Mononoke at all. Rather, she is recognized as the third child of Moro, a princess in her own right. San is possessed by the same hatred as Ashitaka, but is cursed spiritually, even as she remains physically pure. The film makes it very clear that simply removing the figureheads of the conflict, Eboshi, Moro, Otoko, and even the forest spirit, will not cause the cessation of hostilities, will not end the hate. This is made clear when Ashitaka remarks,
If it would lift the curse, I'd let it tear you apart. But even that wouldn't end the killing now, would it?
and as the film progresses, this assertion is fully realized as Ashitaka does not stop Eboshi. He fails to save the forest spirit, and he is unable to prevent the destruction of Irontown. But he is able to save San. The act of saving her is, of course, more complex than the notion might imply. Ashitaka saves San from Eboshi and the people of Irontown in an effort that nearly costs him his life and is only able to survive because of the intervention of San and the forest spirit. Yet this does not lift his curse. This is because San is cursed spiritually, not physically. In fact, when Ashitaka is brought before Moro, she mocks him and derisively asks if he thinks he can save San. Merely the youthful bravado of a boy who does not yet understand the true nature of this conflict. This is mirrored in a later scene when, after rescuing San from the transforming Otoko, Moro asks, sincerely this time,
Ashitaka, can you save the girl you love?
so how does Ashitaka save San? Ashitaka occupies the narrative and structural position of the prince who saves the princess, because he is both an outsider, even among the humans of Irontown, and of equal status to San. But, as has been discussed, the subversion of gender stereotypes is not a mere affect, but a central component of the narrative. But the subversion goes both ways. Ashitaka is not able to save San by slaying a monster or rescuing her from any peril, but by embracing her and in turn causing San to embrace her own humanity. This occurs at the absolute lowest point of the film. The forest god has transformed into the god of death and is searching for his head. Ashitaka asks San for her help. She refuses. She tells him to go away, that she hates all humans. Ashitaka tells her that she is human too. He starts reaching out to her and says her name. She stabs him with a crystal dagger, a token of his affection he had gifted her earlier in the film. San realizes what she has done, that she has hurt someone she loves, and finally embraces her humanity as she is in turn embraced by Ashitaka. Her curse has been broken. We know this because at what may be considered the climax of the film, when San and Ashitaka are struggling to retake the head from Jigo, Ashitaka states that human hands must return it, and it is ultimately Ashitaka and San who once again embrace, who succeed in returning the head and are engulfed in light. His curse has also been broken. I will depict animosity, but that is in order to show the fact that there is something more precious. I depict the bondage of a curse in order to show the joy of liberation. What I will show is the boy reaching an understanding of the girl, and the process of the girl's heart opening up to the boy. In the end, the girl may say to the boy, "I love you, Ashitaka, but I can't forgive human beings." The boy will smile and say, "That's all right. Won't you live together with me?" This is the kind of film I want to make.